Good afternoon, evening, with wherever you're logging in from. We are so excited to have you join us today. My name is Kathie Moehlig. She, her are my pronouns, and I am the founder and executive director of TransFamily Support Services. Those of you that maybe aren't really familiar with us, we help and take families through the navigation of this journey all across the country. Our mission is to save lives by shaping a gender-affirming community. So whether that community starts with a family or is a school or is a small city or all the way across the country. I am the parent of a trans youth. My son started his transition nearly a decade ago, and there were no resources for us when we started. And so this organization has just really organically grown out of that. To date, we have served over 1,212 trans individuals and their families, and we could not be happier to be able to join families and trans individuals wherever they are on their journey and assist them. Today's program is all about our athletes, and I am so excited to be able to bring this program to you. My son is a competitive athlete, and so I know the importance of our kids getting the right and the equality of being able to compete in the sport that they love. We also have been a part of this program, a part of the Changing the Game film, almost from its inception in a very small way. And so watching this piece unfold over the years, being in conversation with all of the crew and the producers, and then seeing it hit the finish line of getting on Hulu, and now really being able to tell these stories in such a grand way is very, very exciting for me. So we have a couple of guests we're going to bring on. If they want to join in, I will do their introductions. First of all, we have Alex. Alex is joining us as the award-winning film producer of Changing the Game. He is also an associate director for the transgender representation at the nation's leading LGBTQ media advocacy organization, GLAAD, who does a tremendous amount of work in really helping to make sure that our trans community's rights and representation are fair and what they should be. He's also the associate producer of the Netflix original documentary Disclosure. If you have not yet watched Disclosure, that should be the next film on your list. It is fabulous. It examines the history of the transgender representation in TV and film. And he is, as I said, the producer of this Hulu original documentary, Changing the Game. He runs the social media accounts and strategy on both films, and he was named one of Forbes 30 under 30 for media in 2017. I'll just add the personal note that I am a huge fan of Alex. We met many years ago when he was a camp counselor at Camp Aeronautic that my son attended, and we have been fast friends since. So welcome, Alex. We're super glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathie. And Kathie was very humble about how she has come into changing the game and her influence and impact on making the film. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we're so grateful to be here with you all and are indebted to the work and support of TransFamily Support Services and Kathie. So thrilled to be here with this conversation.
Thanks, Alex. Our next guest is Asaf Orr. Asaf is another absolutely fabulous person. If you aren't familiar with Asaf, you really need to kind of dive deep into the work that he has been doing. So Asaf is the senior staff attorney and director of NCLR's, which is the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Transgender Youth Project. Asaf works to safeguard the rights of transgender and gender expansive youth and families, to be affirmed and supported for who they are. I love in here that Asaf has been working for more than a decade to really help represent the little t of the LGBT, right? And I am thrilled and amazed every time I get to hear Asaf share or we collaborate on some of the cases that are going on. So Asaf, during his time with NCLR, has represented transgender youth and their families in a wide range of legal matters, including discrimination in school, child custody disputes, child abuse and neglect, and access to affirming medical care and mental health care. He also works behind the scene to increase inclusion of transgender athletes in all levels and types of sports, expanding access to transition-related care for Medicaid recipients, and helping those trying to access that medical treatment. And I know that Asaf is feeling a little bit like just finishing a marathon with this current legislative session that's been going on across the country and all of the anti-trans bills that were going on that he was a part of. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So I'd like to start off a little bit. Let's just jump right into some of the legal piece. And Asaf, can you share a bit about why this film and this conversation is so important right now?
So I think there's so many reasons. Going into this legislative session, we knew that there were going to be a number of anti-trans bills that were going to be kind of copycatted across the country. And, sports was one of those issues that unfortunately, people don't have a strong understanding about why it's so critical for transgender people to compete in sports consistent with their gender identity. And also, because of the way that the sort of proponents of these bills talk about sports, they're able to sort of take on this mantle of quote unquote saving women's sports. And so what this movie really does is show, who transgender athletes are and what they're about, and that they're just like all their athletes. They want to compete. They just want to be part of that community, and they want to push themselves to be their best selves. And I think that's a really excellent message to get out there, because the reality again is that people don't really know why transgender athletes want to compete, and unfortunately assume the worst, and are willing to believe all the inaccurate and misleading things that the proponents of these bills talk about. And so having a documentary like this really go in depth into having, the people who see this documentary actually get to know these three athletes. And I think it's also really helpful that not all of their parents or caregivers were sort of your West Coast liberal or East Coast liberal families, because the reality is that those families, really what it's about is loving their kids and making sure that their kids have all the opportunities that all parents want their kids to have. And I think it just really shows, really humanizes trans young people and their families in a really important way.
Yes, absolutely. And as soon as Mack joins us in a few minutes, we definitely will get into some conversations about Grandma Nancy, because we can't have this conversation without talking about Grandma Nancy. So, Alex, do you want to share a little bit about, this film started so long ago, and when the film was being developed and in those first years of its production, who would have ever guessed that it would have ended up airing at a time that was so pivotal across the country for this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, when I was first approached about the film in its inception, I got a cold call from Claire Tucker, my co-producer now, and director Michael Barnett. And they weren't even at the stage of thinking about producing a film. They were just approaching me to really ask questions. Does this kind of film, do these stories need to exist? Are they the right people to tell these stories? How should they go about doing it if I agree that they are the people who should help tell these stories? And, I'm very honest about how I came to this subject matter. Even as a trans man myself, I quickly recognized that I had a lot of discomfort around this conversation about trans inclusion in sport, because as I started interrogating and working in media, I started recognizing the patterns of the only stories that we hear about is when trans athletes are winning. And so this reinforces the false narrative that there is some sort of domination that's happening. And to Asaf's point and to Kathie's point, that trans young people want to participate in athletics just like anyone else. It's to be a part of a team. It's to push yourself. It's to practice and become better and learn how to win and learn how to lose. And so I had to go on my own journey. But ultimately, when I met with Claire and Michael, it was very obvious and apparent to me that their intent was to return these stories to these athletes, which are typically taken and used against them. And when I saw that they were willing to do the work of overcoming whatever bias they had or whatever storytelling cliches they might have accidentally fallen into, I was also willing to do that work and wanted to dive in with them, because my goal as a storyteller and filmmaker is also to be making sure that stories are authentic and accurate. And so as we started on this journey 4.5, 5 years ago, however long it's been, it was just really important to us that we do it right. And unfortunately, the film has become so culturally relevant, but it was even so at the time that we were beginning, because Mack's story at the time was becoming national news headlines, again, without his consent or agency. He just wanted to wrestle boys, and it was because of the Texas state policy that he wasn't allowed to, and that's where that ballooned into a huge national controversy. So, again, it's unfortunate that the film is so culturally relevant right now. And at the same time, these stories have always belonged to the people who it is their actual lives. And so I think hopefully we've created something that will always be important and relevant, and for young trans people to be able to see themselves in these incredible young athletes, and for families also to see themselves and be able to relate to these allies whom we don't typically get to see, to show a roadmap to how to show up for your community. And that may look more unexpected than people assume, as we were talking about with, coastal families, metronormativity, political ideologies. This cuts across that. It's really about love and acceptance. And so I hope that theme and that message is always going to be universal.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, while we're having this conversation, both of you have already kind of talked a little bit about it. Let's talk about why these athletes, why these stories, and a little bit about how trans kids are being put in the media, sometimes without their choice. Sometimes it's the adults in the room think it's a good marker to help push forward whatever agenda or policy is trying to be pushed forward. But let's address that, because I know that, we were first approached by Claire and Mikey, and allowed them to come in and take video of Sam, my son, doing gymnastics, and, working him as being a possible person in the documentary. But that wasn't without having conversation with the right people before I did that, right? And one of whom it was you, Alex, because of your work with GLAAD, but other people too. So why these athletes? Let's start there, Alex, and then we'll bring Asaf into this piece of how these kids keep getting their stories abruptly told.
Yeah. And Kathie, thank you for this question. I think it is so important, especially talking with this audience and group of people, that we were so intentional about the athletes that we feature in the film. We filmed with about 7 athletes, including Kathie's son, Sam. And ultimately it came down to, when we were finalizing who was going to make it into the film, obviously telling more than 3 stories in an hour and a half is not going to be easy, and it will probably not be a smooth storytelling process. But also it was about, for us, Mack and Andrea both had their stories taken from them and used against them. They were hijacked and exploited to justify exclusion and discrimination in so many ways. So their stories were already out there. The film was a way for us to help return those stories to them. And then for Sarah, who is someone who really does want to be in the public, is so good at advocacy and had already put herself out there in so many ways, we considered how the film would either benefit or enhance these young people's lives versus making them more vulnerable or subject to more harassment or violence or any of those things. And so for Mack and Andrea, they were already in the media. This was a way for us to help them retake their narratives. And for someone like Sarah, she's only going to benefit from the platform that she gets from the film because that's who she is. That being said, we had very difficult conversations among the filmmakers about the 7 young people that we did follow, whose lives we, did go into and spent significant time. And we were just so mindful about the ways that, some of the young people who we filmed, we felt were too vulnerable, that the spotlight would not help their lives. And we felt they were in a position that, the film wouldn't bring positivity into their long-term lives, because when and I'm going to let Asaf speak to this as well, a trans person being in media at such a young age is different than for LGB people. It means that your gender history will forever be known. No matter where you go, what you do, it will always be on Google. So, we had those difficult conversations, and it was very intentional about who ultimately makes it into the film. And if you talk to any one of the athletes who are featured, they have agency. They know the long-term consequences of what's happening with these stories being told on such a wide platform like Hulu, and are benefiting. Their lives are enhanced from this. At least that's what they've told me. And when Mack joins, he can share from his side. But Asaf, I'd love for you to weigh in as well, because I know we have similar feelings on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a difficult thing. The one thing I tell my clients all the time is, just because you're trans doesn't mean you have to be a martyr. You don't. Just because you've been discriminated against, something horrible's happened to you, does not mean that you have to be the one that fights this fight. And, because it takes a lot, right? Being out in the public, even filing a lawsuit, even if you're not, being public about it, takes a lot. And so, but having the sort of added aspect of being public and being, interviewed by media, even if it's just print media, right? And it's not, video and live television and all that kind of stuff. It takes a lot out of you. And it's something that does, nowadays lives in perpetuity, and, a lot of at least when you're involved in a lawsuit, a lot of the documents are public. And so you're talking about, any random person can walk into the courthouse and access those records. And so it's, that's not to scare people to not do it, but it's just to be thoughtful about it and really have intentional conversations about, do you want to be out? How out do you want to be? What is this going to look like 5 minutes from now and 5 years from now? And what is it going to mean for your family? Because it's also, in a lot of these families, it's not just the parents and the trans kid. There may be siblings or grandparents or, that are sort of within the close orbit of the family that are also going to be affected by the family's decision to be public about their child's trans status. And, I think, so again, and I guess the other, for me, it's like, if you start out private, you can always become more public. Once you're public, you can't become private again, or it's very hard. You have to go to really great lengths. And I know families that have done it, but they've had to change their names, they've moved, they've done really extensive things to gain that back. And even still, you still get you look like someone I used to know, or someone that looks familiar. And, you can always say, no, that's not me, but deep down, you know that it was. And that can be unnerving, especially if it's something you're trying to get away from. And we've seen, for example, now also one last thing, and Alex, I can see you're jumping at the bit to get in, but now that we have all these data aggregators out there, everything you do, it's going to show up somewhere. And that was not the case even 5 years ago, and certainly not 10 years ago. So these are just things to think about and to be really careful about, because, again, how you feel about it now is not necessarily how you're going to feel about it years from now.
And to your point, Asaf, and every point you made is spot on for me as well. We can't anticipate what the culture looks like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. I mean, I feel confident that we're moving in a progressively positive direction. That being said, we can't anticipate what exactly it will look like. I also wanted to mention too, I think I've talked to parents and guardians about, well, if we're not going public, is that signifying that we're somehow ashamed or we feel a certain way? And I always say, no. There is something to be said about safeguarding and protecting the youth, the innocence, the ability to grow up and become. And it has nothing to do with not being proud. I think it's about agency above all else, and allowing young people to determine what's best for them at a time that they really have the capacity to know what is best for them. And these require a lot of just deep conversations and thought. And to Asaf's point, I think I'm personally very passionate about all kinds of different ways that trans people can show up. You can be an advocate or an activist if you want to be. You also don't have to be. By the nature of being yourself and showing up in the world, that does make a difference. And so, when we talk about representation, which I'm sure we'll get to, the representation that I'm really passionate about seeing is trans people occupying all different kinds of spaces, pursuing all different kinds of professions and fields. Because when I was growing up, I only saw activists, and that never resonated or related with my experience of being a storyteller. And so part of you being and becoming and being true and authentic to whatever energizes you will allow for others to see themselves in the greater possibilities that are expanded on, because there's authentic envisioning of what that can be.
And just to follow up on that, I think, one of the nice things is sort of looking back. One of my very first cases was a complaint we filed against Arcadia Unified School District on behalf of a trans kid who's denied use of the boys' restroom and locker room, and told that on an overnight field trip he couldn't room in the same cabin with his male peers. And he asked to remain private, and I think that was, certainly my inclination was to do that. And throughout the years, as some of you may know, that case resulted in a historic agreement between the United States government and the Arcadia Unified School District, which was the first time that Title IX was used to protect transgender students in schools. And that whole process took a few years. And so we checked back in with our client and said, hey, do you want to be public now? And his answer was no. And over the years we checked back with him, and he'd still say no. And we're now coming up on a decade. We filed the complaint in October of 2011. So we're coming up with a 10-year anniversary, and we approached him and he said, yeah, I'm happy to be public. Right. So, we have since come public with him. And, what he said to me, as we're kind of planning all that stuff, is he said, look, I've really appreciated the last 10 years, just being able to be me and kind of choosing when I come into being an activist, and kind of just being a kid, right? He was in middle school at the time, and he's now just graduated college. And so, yeah, I mean, just because you choose not to be public right at the moment of like this sort of major inflection point in your life because you're joining a lawsuit or, doing something kind of activisty in a way, does not mean you can't do it later. And look, the reality is that people still hugely benefited from his courage in bringing that complaint, even if you don't know his name.
I think both of you make such exceptional points, right? Alex, I love the idea of, if you're a trans person and not an activist, it doesn't make you less of a trans person, right? Because I know people who we've had those conversations. And also in our work that we do with families of young trans kids, talking to them in terms of, this is an intimate experience your family is having, and we have the right to not invite everybody to an intimate experience, right? And so, what I know, and I'm thinking that probably many parents on this call are probably feeling the same way listening to this conversation is, but as parents of trans kids, we feel like many of us feel the place of, but we need to work to make it a better place and a safer place for our kid and all kids. So, Asaf, is there something that you can share? And I'm thinking, in particular, I think about those parents who are East Coast, West Coast parents, where things are going well for their child. They're being accepted at school. They're using the bathrooms and the locker rooms and all of that stuff. And we're horrified as we saw these bills showing up across the country for the community of trans families that's attacking every aspect of these kids' lives. So what's your recommendation? What can we do as parents that want to be advocates and allies, whether we're out with it or not out with it, and protecting our own children? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really great ways to get involved. And I think it's, again, all going to depend on comfort level, right? And it's really first engaging with your kid and your family and kind of figuring out, how out are you willing to be? I mean, I think the reality is that even doing things at the local level is really important, right? Even though, if you're living on the coast, you're not living in states that are necessarily considering bills like this, although that's not, you should not take that for granted either. But, I think even just having those conversations with the parents in your community about what it's like to be a parent of a trans kid, what it's like to raise a trans kid, that, as a parent, you want for your child everything that any other parent wants. And, in working, in raising your trans kid, you are just doing your best and kind of learning what their unique needs are and trying to do what you can to meet them. I think getting people to realize that parents of trans kids are no different and trans kids are no different is the most critical thing. And we need to not assume that, everyone in our community, our local community, has that same feeling. I will say one of the most powerful moments I've had in sort of my legal career was we were litigating a case in Ohio, and our client was, was Jane Doe, and we had submitted pictures of her to the court under seal. So it was only the court and the other attorneys that could see it. And at the oral argument on this particular motion, the judge actually turned to the attorneys for the school district and said, "Have you seen Jane Doe? She's a girl," right? And in that moment, that was a judge basically saying, like, if I saw Jane Doe on the street, I would have no idea, right? And, this is a family that clearly loves their child, just like every other family. And I think that is, those small things are extraordinarily powerful. Beyond that, I think it's really about elevating the voices of folks in those communities, right? In those sort of local states. If you have the financial resources, providing donations to local organizations working to fight those bills and organize folks. Because I think, what we saw this legislative session, the most both heartbreaking and amazing thing was that trans kids came out in force, right? To really say, look, you can't discriminate against us. You can't discriminate against us without knowing us. And you saw that happen in Utah, for example. The governor of Utah said, I'm not going to sign this bill because I've met these kids. The governor of Arkansas said, I've met these kids and this is cruel, right? Maybe if we did a more limited ban, I'd be okay with it, but this is too far, right? And that is both heartwarming, but again, these kids were really putting themselves out there. And so being able to provide that support, that emotional support, the financial support to the organizations working with those young people. I think those are the critical things. Don't assume that just because you're on the coast, you have to do something, in the states that are currently facing these bills. There was a former governor of Pennsylvania. They used to describe Pennsylvania as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Mississippi in between. And I think that's true of any state, right? There are going to be pockets where being trans is okay, or being trans is not going to sort of immediately put you in danger. But right outside those communities, there needs to still be a lot of education. And so taking on that job is really important. But again, it's all about how out you want to be. And I think that's really the first question.
Yeah. And real quickly, I wanted to add to that as well. And I know that Mack is about to jump on, if he hasn't already, maybe potentially, is to say that in the film you see families that are coming from different political affiliations. You are seeing families who are not the ones you would traditionally expect would be allies. And so I think if you are in a position of being an ally, it is incumbent upon allies to do that important work of having tough conversations with your community. I see a lot of shutting people down and writing people off because they say something wrong or do something wrong. There's a time and a place to do that if someone isn't actually committed to learning or being open to learning what they don't know. But it is absolutely critical for those in positions able to do so, to have those tough conversations with people who there may not be a full understanding or familiarity or exposure, and bringing them forward versus pushing them out. And I think that's part of the power of what Changing the Game shows as well, is, allies that are not who you might expect, but those are people that if they weren't already there, they can be brought along because they have love for their families and communities. So if you are able to, and you have the energy and you have the privilege, and many of us do, bring people forward, bring them along. Do not shame them if they haven't had that exposure or education, because the language that we use, that's a certain amount of privilege we have access to, that we can use the language that we do. And so having a bit of grace where there is intention to grow.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I know that my camera is having some issues. It keeps going on and off, but I'm glad you can at least hear me. So we'll just, that's fine. We'll leave it there. Is Mack on yet? No. Doesn't look like it. Okay.
He's close. He's close.
He's close. Okay. So Alex, I guess the next question that I have, what have you found that's the most effective way in educating people about this issue? I read your, was it Esquire interview just recently, and you had some really good things to say about the change that you've already seen happen because of this film. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yes, of course. Working at GLAAD, my commitment is to media representation, which, if 80% of Americans say they personally don't know someone who's transgender, that means the majority of what they understand about who this community is has been misinformed from media. And so when they actually get to know trans people, when they get to know trans kids, when they see us in our full lives, and not just as our gender identities, or not just as athletes, but actually as people in our communities, in our relationships, in all these different ways, there's an illumination that happens because there's a shared humanity that's finally seen again. And so Changing the Game is truly, I hate to say it, but I don't hate to say it, but I hate to replicate the words. It is actually changing hearts and minds in the ways that we created it for, so that people see Mack, Andrea, Sarah, and Terry as they were as kids, just wanting to be themselves and play sports. And people can relate to that in a way that, oh yeah, like, of course, I would want the same, whether that's for me or for my kids or my community's kids. So it's been powerful. I mean, storytelling, when it is done right, it connects us in our common humanity and foibles and messiness and all of that. And so, I think Mack has just jumped on, but we always say how grateful and honored we were as filmmakers that they entrusted us to help them tell their stories in the ways that are true to them, because that really does have transformative power to change culture.
Absolutely. And such an important piece, such a vitally important piece, which is what I felt in that first conversation that I had with Mikey and Claire in, way back when, of the message was just so important. So without much more conversation, I'd like to bring on Mack. Mack Beggs is an activist for transgender student athlete rights across the country, including for himself. He's currently enrolled at Life University and is pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Human Development and Social Change to become a gender therapist. Yes, I love that. Mack works with the Equality Texas and Glisson, Kansas, to continue to advocate for the equality of transgender youth. He's a guest speaker at influential events like Austin Pride and appeared at the Grand Marshal for San Antonio's LGBT Pride Parade. And I am absolutely confident that they adored every moment with you. Mack enjoys being a positive influence in his community and is an outdoor enthusiast, as all good athletes are. In his free time, he loves to spend time with his friends, family, 2 pit bull pups, and his girlfriend. So welcome, Mack. We're so glad to have you here. I guess the first thing is tell us how you are. This film was, originally done several years ago, and life has obviously changed a lot for you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, by the way. I was making tacos.
No worries.
But it's changed in a sense of like me finding my profession and really sticking on a path that really is for like me now. And like right now I'm retired from wrestling. I'm doing martial arts, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and just doing my schooling and working hard and fighting for these kids that don't have to go through what I had to go through.
And earlier in the conversation, we were talking about that piece around that not every trans person has to be an activist. And so this piece of you living your life of, I'm doing other things in wrestling now, and I'm living this way, and I'm doing this, is just as important for our youth as when you were on the mat fighting that state law and doing the best that you could with what you had in front of you. So I don't want you to discount any part of what you're doing now, because people are watching you probably even more now with the film hitting Hulu, and you just being your best self is, as a parent of a trans person, is so vitally important, right?
Yeah, it's very important because, everyone thinks that, well, not everyone, but like it's important to know that when you're young that you have multiple endless possibilities in front of you that you can create for yourself. And I think that's like really important. And just like my journey alone, like it didn't have to end there, like with me being on the mat and everything happening. And I thought it was very important to come out with the fact that, I think me helping kids is more important. I think me getting closer and being a better ally and being somebody that somebody can look up to in the community is more important to me. And I just am taking a firmer role on it.
Yeah, awesome. So before we dig too deep into this, because I know folks who have watched the film, I've talked to people who watched it last week. Tell us how Grandma Nancy is.
Yeah, she's awesome. She actually is doing really great. I've seen another side of her that has blossomed, especially since my niece just walked into the world. and she means the world to me. And I feel like a new sense of like hope and humanity and loving and care has entered into our family. So a lot of things are really good right now.
Awesome. Awesome. So tell us a little bit about, so many times people overlook this piece when we start talking about trans athletes, about why youth start sports in the first place, right? Just like in your story and in so many others, it gets hijacked into all of these other narratives. But why is it so important for our youth to be able to participate in sports?
It's the most important time in your life where you're making relationships, and I feel like that's important because the friendships that I have now have happened since I was a kid. I still talk to my softball teammates I play softball with, and people back when I was in dance company. Yeah, I used to dance. Not just, I did everything. And so like those like relationships that I've established, like it's important in everyday life, and especially the teachings that you get when you are in a sport, and the discipline and the self-care and the self-worth of wanting to be something than just you then and there when you're just like a little kid. It makes you open up your mind, and like makes you want to follow dreams that you make for yourself.
And as a parent, I pull out this piece of, it was heart-wrenching for me as the parent of a trans son who was a competitive athlete all through high school as well, like just how heart-wrenching that whole thing was, and the way the media treated you and disrespected you. And so what has it been like now with having changing the game, and as Alex said earlier, you getting to take your story back? And what's that like in the media for you, and as people approach you, which I'm sure many people do?
I think it's important to like just signify the fact that, this is me and this is my life. And for, I guess, people like politicians or legislation to mention my name in, against these bills, I'm just like, that's not who I am and that's not what happened. And it's very important because it gives me realism to myself that I did that. Like, it doesn't discredit me, but people want to discredit who I am and what I did as a person and what I did then and there. And it's just good for me. Yeah, it's good for me to be true and let people know the truth.
Awesome. And Alex, you earlier made a comment of talking about representation. And, it's so vitally important to have that full representation across stories. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important to see ourselves. When I was growing up, like the first thing I ever saw of someone that looked like what I thought my experience was Boys Don't Cry. And that was the only future I could envision for myself. And so with a diversity of different stories and experiences that people can access and see, that will just widen the expanse of what's possible for how people become, for who they can become, because they can see themselves in a constellation of different experiences and identities. And so, even within changing the game, I love how different Mack is from Sarah, is from Andrea, is from Terry. They are such vastly different people. And so it's just so important to see yourself and to also see who you could potentially be. I mean, we had mentioned earlier Grandma Nancy and how we need to talk more about Grandma Nancy, and that like she resonates with so many people because they either want to be like her or they want someone like her in their life. And you need to be able to see that kind of representation to know that it's possible, that like you can aspire to be a Grandma Nancy. You can be a Grandma Nancy in someone's life. So it's a both and. We need it for ourselves and we need it for others. And that's why I'm so passionate about doing the work I do, because it can be transformative to see yourself and to see others and know that you're not alone in the world. Because I think another thing that often gets missed is when we're seeing all these stories specifically about trans athletes, it's always about alienation and isolation and controversy. And yet there is so much positive. There's so much support. There are broader coalitions of communities coming together because they see that these attacks and targets on trans athletes' backs implicates everybody. It means that if you are gender nonconforming in any which way, you are also a target. And so, you know, we also need to, I'm a big love person. I love love. I want to see stories about love and all different kinds of love of sport, love of self, love with others, love with grandparents, love with friends, because the more we see of that, the more we can create of it, I believe.
Absolutely.
Can I
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
quickly jump
Go
in?
ahead.
I think one of the things that changing the game really helps bring out is again, folks really don't realize that prior to this legislative session, there were 19 states that allowed transgender young people to compete consistent with their gender identity without any requirements for any medical intervention or anything, right? That's a lot of states. And there were many of them very populous states, although there are states in there, you know, like Florida was one of them. Montana was one of them. Wyoming, right? These are states that like you would not anticipate that transgender students were able to compete consistent with their gender identity, but it in fact was happening. And the sky didn't fall. And unfortunately, what the proponents of these bills were able to do was essentially to recreate reality and revise history, to suggest that transgender student athletes are something new and that they're gonna harm sports, in particular women's sports, which is not true. And as Alex mentioned, when we hear about trans athletes, it's often, unfortunately, only the times when they're just winning. And so there's this perception that there's this domination of transgender athletes in sports, when in fact there are some good athletes who are transgender, but that's because they train hard and work hard and are just good at their sport. But the vast majority of transgender people who compete in sports fit within the size and skill level of their peers and really, are there to be part of a team, to gain all the life lessons that Mack talked about that are so important in just being part of a sport.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I got to see that up front close with my son, of the importance of him being on this boys' competitive gymnastics team and being one of the guys. And we had a situation where he was kind of accidentally outed while we were at a competition in Las Vegas. Even though he had been out in the media, most of the boys on the team did not know that he was trans. And there was this media piece that went out across social media and everybody was tagged in it. And I'm like, dude, you got 30 seconds to tell me how you want me to handle this, because in a moment, all of these boys sitting around you are going to know this information. And it was so vitally important to him that every one of his teammates contacted him and said, you're just the same boy that we've always known you to be. You're just Sam, and had no issues with it. But that's not the case for everybody by any means. So I think that that conversation is really important. So Mack, you have this microphone, you have this platform now that you didn't have back when you were competing in high school in Texas. They had the camera on you, but not necessarily the mic in front of you. So what do you want to share with youth out there now that you do have this platform and mic in front of you?
To just keep to keep being yourself. And when you're a kid, you think that things are small and you feel like you're just a small speck in the world, but you could really make a difference with just your voice and just talking to people and having conversations, and especially important ones that could affect the lives of many, and your voice can amplify that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alex, is there more that you want to say, having the experience of walking through all the years of this film in production and the work that you all are doing at GLAAD? What do you want to say to those youth out there?
Take your time. You have a lot of life to live, and you will continue growing as you go through life with the different people that you meet and the different experiences that you have. And transition is just one of the points in life that we grow and change. There are so many, and your becoming doesn't need to be limited by anything because you haven't seen it yet. Imagine who you want to be and what you want to do, and you can. It's going to be an exciting future for you. Just know it's not always going to be easy, but it will be worth it.
Absolutely. I love that. Just that becoming, we heard so often from the vice president, I may be the first, I won't be the last. And I think about that so many times with so many different trans individuals, right? Just that piece of, you may be the first trans person to accomplish this, but you won't be the last. But the work that you do is important to get us to that place, where our youth have all positive role models in front of them, and not folks that the media has kind of taken them through the ringer in which Mack had to go through, and through some of the challenges in the legal system that so many of our families have to go through. And Asaf, I know we talked a little bit about what folks can do to help fight things, but can you give us a little bit of, and I'm going to really put you on the spot here because I really want your opinion of what's the next 3 to 5 years look like when it comes to trans rights, and in specific trans youth rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think, kind of going along with Alex, I think, what we're going to see in the next 3 to 5 years is just a continued awareness about the importance of supporting transgender young people in the wide range of areas that they exist in their lives, from home to school to access to medical care. That's not to say there aren't going to be setbacks. I mean, we anticipate that a number of these bills that didn't get to sort of get fully heard this past legislative session will come back next legislative session, because we're talking about an election year, and it's an opportunity, again, for legislators to use transgender young people, unfortunately, as a scapegoat, and sort of continue to perpetuate misinformation. So I don't want to say that this was the last year and you're not going to ever see it again. It will come back. But I think the other thing that we're starting to see, though, and in small ways and hopefully soon larger ways, is that, there are people who are realizing that transgender kids just want to be kids, and it's really important, if we're saying as a society we care about kids, that we need to just support them. So I think we're going to start to, we're going to continue seeing just an increase in sort of access and acceptance generally. Again, it's not going to be universal, but we're moving in that direction, and so you're going to start to see, at least in the legal realm, I'm hopeful that the cases challenging the various anti-trans bills that did pass this session will be successful, and again will further continue what we're seeing. This kind of slow march towards recognition that discrimination against transgender people is sex discrimination. The Supreme Court already held that in the context of employment, and other courts have already rightly extended it into other areas. And so I think we're going to just continue seeing that. And I can't understate the importance of having the Biden administration in place now, and the kind of steps they'll be taking over the next few years in terms of implementing regulations that are going to further provide guidance to insurance companies, to schools, to homeless shelters, to anyone that sort of interacts with trans people and that is affected by federal law, on what it means to not discriminate against transgender people. So I think ultimately, what we're going to see is things continuing to get better. Again, that's not going to mean that it's always going to be linear and that there isn't going to be pushback, but things will be moving in a forward direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I first started doing this work, I had said I'd love to get to a place where I don't have to do this work, right? Work myself right out of a job. And then for a while I was feeling like, oh my God, that's never going to happen. Maybe not even in my son's lifetime. But now I'm a little bit more hopeful than I used to be, and can foresee that, the future you talk about, Asaf, is definitely within reach for sure. So we have just a couple of minutes left. So I'm just going to open, if any of you have something that you want to communicate to folks that we haven't already, feel free to unmute and say that now.
I will just say that if changing the game, if you watched it and it moved you, share it with people. If you haven't watched it, watch it. And because what we've seen is that when people do, when they take an hour and 30 minutes, their minds are changed, their hearts are opened. And so that is a great first step from moving people in empathy to moving them to action. Because once people are invested, they get to know these incredible young people. They want to do something to make the world better for people like them and just communities at large. So use this film that we fought. I mean, we channeled these athletes to get it onto Hulu. So take advantage of it and use it to your advantage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. Mack, is there something you want to communicate?
I'm going to say the same thing as Alex. This is a film that I really think that will change your mind if your willingness to learn about the trans community of love and acceptance, and just being a better ally, and just being able to, help us. That's all we ask for. We just want to share our story, and hopefully this doesn't happen to, another kid.
Absolutely. In working with families, I tend to load people up with resources. Here's a bunch of resources. Read this, watch this, read this, watch this. And not in, it's great if the parents are watching it, but it's really about share this with your inner circle, share this with your circle of influence, share this with the people you work with and with your extended family, because they're not having this experience that you are directly with their own child. And we need all the allies that we can get in the world to be able to get to that place that Asaf was talking about, where we continue to see respect and less discrimination. Asaf, I'm going to give you last words if you have any.
Well, I was just going to say, in addition to circulating the film, which I think is phenomenal, is to just, promote other sources of information that is actual information, not misinformation, right? That, if we actually want to talk about saving women's sports or protecting women's sports, let's actually do those things and not claim we're doing it in the name of, discriminating against transgender people, which is, again, those kinds of, that misinformation travels very fast and is very easy to believe, but is wholly inaccurate. So in addition to pushing out the film, really encourage people to find sources that actually are conveying accurate information, because you want them to not only continue talking about this great film, but also to say to their friends, if you want actual information, here's where you can go to get it. And just continue doing the work of public education, because that's, so critical.
Yes.
I just dropped in the chat on Changing the Game's website. We've put together a list of accurate, good resources, and CLRs will also be added after this call, but that's a good place to also start and circulate. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So Changing the Game, watch it on Hulu. Thank you, Lucas, who just put up that website with all the resources. I am beyond thrilled that I got to be a part of the beginning of this film and all the way through to seeing it to this grand space of really out there changing people's hearts and minds. And I'm truly grateful to the three of you for taking time out on a Sunday afternoon to have this conversation. It will live on all of our social media and our YouTube channel, and I know will be watched over and over again because it's such a vitally important conversation. So thank you all so much for your time. Thank you to everybody who tuned in and watched. Pass around that resource of watching Changing the Game, and let's make sure that all of our trans athletes have the right to compete in the sport that they so love. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy Sunday.